Hey folks, welcome back to the EVO Studios. Today we want to talk about our comprehensive test of the GoPro Hero7. Now since this camera has come out, there has been a lot of talk about its HyperSmooth stabilization feature. Basically how that works, according to GoPro, is that it crops in the sensor about 10%. So the sensor in this camera, a little bigger than the one that was in the Hero 6, optically, image-wise, pretty much identical in terms of performance out of the sensor, but it is a little larger, and that allows GoPro to add that 10% crop, which is where they're getting that electronic stabilization from. The camera has been promoted as a gimbal killer. So naturally here at EVO Gimbals, we wanted to put it to the test and see if that was actually the case. Now I will say that after testing this thing extensively over the last month, it is a pretty spectacular camera. The stabilization in this is much better than the stabilization in former models, and it definitely does have an application where you wouldn't necessarily need to use a gimbal. But those are applications where you probably wouldn't have used a gimbal anyway. It just kind of smooths out the video more so than it would otherwise. So for example, we took this camera mountain biking. When we were out on the trails, we noticed that while it did a really good job when it was just mounted to the chest mount with no gimbal, it wasn't 100% smooth. There wasn't that kind of like floating effect where you felt like you were on board and everything was just kind of flying by. You did kind of feel the bumps a little bit. Now, it was a much bigger improvement over former generations of GoPro, but I definitely wouldn't say it was a gimbal killer. When we took the EVO SS gimbal, mounted it to our chest, put the GoPro Hero7 on that, and went down the trail, the results were just better. It was smoother around the corners. It was able to take the impacts from me knuckling all those jumps and hitting all the rocks on the trail a little better. You could just tell that there wasn't those little vibrations that you get upon an impact with just the GoPro on a mount itself weren't there when you're using a gimbal. So, you know, the gimbal still has its place for an application like mountain biking. Now, what about other applications like, for example, skateboarding? Well, we went to a skate park. I went with my buddy Willis, and I got to film him skating. And I will say, when I was standing on the deck and I had just the camera on an extension pole with no gimbal, it performed really well. You know, I wouldn't need a gimbal for that, but that would be something that I usually wouldn't use a gimbal for anyway. Typically, you know, I would use a gimbal for something when there's a lot of movement from me as the filmer, walking, running, skateboarding, whatever it may be. And so when I was just standing there on the deck, having the HyperSmooth stabilization in the camera with just a selfie stick was great. When we went to the skate park and I started running to follow Willis and try to, you know, film his whole line, not on a board but just running just to test it out, the image kind of fell apart in terms of stabilization. It definitely was not as stable as when it was on the gimbal. The gimbal shots turned out really strong the whole time. It works really well. Basically just turn the image stabilizer off on the camera and mount it to the gimbal, and we had incredible results. I really do think the Hero7 is GoPro's best camera to date. It should be. It's the latest model, but it hasn't always been the case. But I do think that this camera has a really, really strong image, though it is, you know, supposed to be almost identical to the 6. I think that combined with the HyperSmooth makes it a really good camera. Now, what about the time warp feature, the moving time-lapse feature that also has stabilization? That's essentially what it is. It's just a time-lapse feature. It stabilizes your time-lapse. Well, I tested this out. I got my longboard out, my cruiser deck, and went for a little ride around town. I went out and I did the same lap a couple times. I did it once with just the camera, the GoPro Hero7 Black, on an extension pole and skated around. And what I noticed was that every time I was pushing, you could tell there was a lot of movement. When it's sped up, everything, all the movements are kind of like exasperated because they're coming at you so fast. Well, it did produce a really cool effect, the time warp feature, stabilizing that time lapse. When I put the camera on a gimbal and did the same loop, it was a night and day difference. The time warp feature is awesome. I could see if you're mounting it to a car or you know, mounting it to something that's going to be more or less smooth, as opposed to walking or running or skateboarding or biking, whatever it may be. I could see that being a beneficial feature, but I still think that you're going to get better performance out of the GoPro Hero7 Black if it's on a gimbal. So while this camera is being promoted as the gimbal killer due to its HyperSmooth stabilization, I gotta say that a gimbal is still going to outperform the HyperSmooth stabilization. I think you're gonna get better performance out of this camera when it's mounted to a gimbal for many applications. What would those applications be? Any sort of action that is jarring in nature, mountain biking, dirt biking, skateboarding, running, walking even to a certain extent. When you're walking, it's hard to just hold something still, and that's why gimbals exist. And while the HyperSmooth stabilization does do a great job, it can only do so much at this point. So I think it is really cool. I think it'll be a dramatic improvement for a lot of users' videos who have just been using, say, GoPro Hero 3, 4, 5, or 6, or even the earlier versions. I think this is going to be a dramatic improvement for them, but for people who are really looking to get the most out of GoPro's best camera to date, you're going to want to mount this thing on a gimbal to really get the smoothest, most professional looking shots. And that is shown in the test. Let us know what you think, and we're gonna keep testing this camera. This is a great camera. I've been working with the Super Photo. It's a ton of fun. There's a lot of cool features in this camera. I do think that it's not perfect. There are still some bugs with the Hero 7. Do have some menu freezing issues. It is often still hard to touch the right spot on the LCD screen in order to get it to do what you want it to do. But it is probably GoPro's best camera to date, and it's a lot of fun to use. So let us know what you think in the comments. Hit that subscribe button, and until next time, keep it smooth.